Democratic lawmakers are finally making huge progress on the fourth stimulus package, and it has been decided that billions of dollars in unused relief money will be going towards new stimulus checks for certain Americans. If you want to receive this fourth stimulus check, then be sure to continue watching this video because you definitely don't want to miss out on this. The Pennsylvania legislature has until June 30th to pass a new budget approaches. Pass a new budget, support for some spending of the state's billions of dollars in remaining stimulus money, and surplus tax revenue is gaining bipartisan action. Discussions are preliminary, and top budget negotiators want to reach a deal as soon as possible, but lawmakers, lobbyists, and top staff pointed to a small number of partisan proposals that have been put forward. On issues from the environment to childcare, there could be building blocks for a spending plan. The House Appropriations Committee Chair told reporters this week that we move forward trying to identify areas of agreement first, and then we'll identify areas of disagreement and try to work through those. Each year, Pennsylvania's governor and legislature must agree on how to route tens of billions of dollars to education, economic development, and human services. These are decisions that affect every person in Pennsylvania. But the state's financial picture has changed in recent years, with the state's coffers getting $8 billion boost from stimulus money in 2021. In response, Wolf and his legislative allies called on the legislature to spend some of that windfall on higher education, paid family leave, and school repairs, among many other priorities. Early this year, Wolf released a budget proposal that would appropriate billions of dollars more to education and infrastructure. Republicans countered that additional spending would actually fiscally be irresponsible. But everybody, Pennsylvania still has about $2 billion in remaining stimulus money, and at least $5 billion in surplus tax revenue. To address the soaring cost of living and inflation, Governor Wolf is pushing the legislature to approve using American Rescue Plan money to give people $2,000 stimulus checks. They would go to every household earning less than $80,000, which is the majority of people in Pennsylvania. Other issues are getting Republican attention, everybody, like more state funding for childcare and pre-K, nursing home, and housing. Progressive lawmakers have been building bipartisan support for a broad housing plan, Whole Homes Repair Fund, which would actually use stimulus money to provide grants to homeowners and landlords alike to make renovations big and small. After 2 years and 6 relief bills into the crisis, the U.S. has spent the majority of its available stimulus relief funding, but billions of dollars across a handful of categories have not gone out the door. Beginning under the former president and continuing now with President Biden, Congress has approved some $4.5 trillion in total aid spending. According to Treasury Department data, federal agencies have formally committed to using about $4 trillion in that, and have made about $3.5 trillion in actual payments to date. Budget experts say that it can often take time for the total pot of funds to make its way to the American people. That's because government agencies such as the SBA and Department of Labor go through a process of legally committing to a portion of allotted funding, which is known as obligating. Then they start to actually spend it. The $500 billion or so in available relief resources have not been obligated and may not end up being spent by agencies. What are your thoughts on this, everybody? Is President Biden going to do something about this and help out the American people with stimulus checks this year? Or will President Biden hold back the stimulus? Tell me what you think on this.
Mr. Dodaro, I'm going to start with a round of questions, and then it looks like the next person up will be Senator Johnson. Mr. Dodaro, to date, GAO has made 121 recommendations on actions that Congress could take to address the wasteful spending and inefficient operations listed in the annual duplication report. There are currently 59 open recommendations. How should Congress prioritize which recommendations to address? Are there particular recommendations that you think we should focus on first?
I absolutely think those recommendations that have significant dollar savings potential ought to be among the top priorities.
Right.
I issued a report last month that I've repeatedly warned Congress that the federal government's on an unsustainable long-term fiscal path. The more actions Congress could take to reduce federal spending, the more that situation will help be resolved over time. There's also very important sets of recommendations that go to improving public health and safety, and I'd also give those high priority as well. The recommendations we've made, for example, in this year's report about dealing with what's becoming, we have about 50 million gallons of hazardous waste that we haven't got rid of, and our costs are going up every year. I mentioned the healthcare recommendations we have. There's the recommendations we have on biodefense strategies this year, very important recommendations on the pandemic. So my view, Senator, would be where it saves a lot of money and where it has a direct impact on public health and safety, those ought to be the top priorities.
Thank you. There are 8 new recommendations across 5 issue areas for Congress in this year's report. One involves allowing the Department of Energy to run a pilot program to examine alternative.
So I would agree that this year is very different than 2020. However, when you look at things like the percentage of stocks above their 50-day moving averages, it is now down to 2%. That certainly was present back in 2016 and 2018. We have finally started to see some evidence of a little bit of VIX backwardation, although it's not at levels that I think are probably important just yet. There's 70% of stocks now that are down more than 20% off their highs. So, any given year when the market's down 20%, the odds certainly are in your favor to try to take a stab at trying to buy for a rebound. But it's much different, in saying that is it a bottom versus the bottom, and whether it's going to be a recession with a capital R versus a small r. And really none of us know the question to that. But, I think it's a great risk reward when I start to see some evidence of equity put to call getting close to 1, which was near what we saw in March 2020. Obviously, some evidence this past week of a little bit of oversized selling, that meaning the TRIN or the ARMS index showed 2 readings of over 3.5. So some big selling on the downside. And that came specifically from a lot of groups that had not been going down recently, like energy all of a sudden, and utilities. And, these starting to join technology on the downside, I think is a meaningful change in character for this market that investors should pay attention to.
When do you make a more definitive statement, and what causes you to do so? What's the level that makes sense to you in your mind?
Well, look, technical analysis is all about price action. And while, myself or anybody could say we're getting close, we need to see markets go from a downtrend to starting to make higher highs and higher lows. And unfortunately, there's no way to catch the bottom of that. That's going to take a movement over 4,200. So I have some cycles that suggest that we're going to bottom towards the end of June, towards the Russell rebalance, potentially as early as next week. And I think a couple things are important. One is that we seem to be getting close to a time when yields and also the dollar should peak out. And those are important because times when the dollar is rising rapidly happened in 2000, 2001, 2008, also 2014. Those proved to be difficult for the market. So if growth starts to slow meaningfully, and we're seeing evidence of copper breaking down substantially this week in a way that the dollar starts to roll over, and I think that might be a few weeks away. And the 30-year has really peaked out right near 2018 highs. And we saw evidence today of technology outperforming as yields drop. So that's the key for investors. Watch when yields and the dollar start to roll over. Growth should start to act better. You look at FANG stocks this week, stocks like Apple, Amazon, Netflix, they were only down about 3